Chapter 8. My first quarter at Lowood seemed an age, and not the golden age either. It comprised an irksome struggle with difficulties in habituating myself to new rules and unwanted tasks. The fear of failure in these points harassed me worse than the physical hardships of my lot, though these were no trifles. During January, February, and part of March, the deep snows and after their melting, the almost impassable roads, prevented our stirring beyond the garden walls, except to go to church. But within these limits we had to pass an hour every day in the open air. Our clothing was insufficient to protect us from the severe cold. We had no boots. The snow got into our shoes and melted there. Our ungloved hands became numbed and covered with chilblains, as were our feet. I remember well the distracting irritation I endured from this cause every evening, when my feet inflamed, and the torture of thrusting the swelled, raw, and stiff toes into my shoes in the morning. Then the scanty supply of food was distressing. With the keen appetites of growing children, we had scarcely sufficient to keep alive a delicate invalid. From this deficiency of nourishment resulted an abuse which pressed hardly on the younger pupils. Whenever the famished great boys had an opportunity, they would coax or menace the little ones out of their portion. Many a time I have shared between two claimants the precious morsel of brown bread distributed at tea time, and after relinquishing to a third half the contents of my mug of coffee, I have swallowed the remainder with an accompaniment of secret tears, forced from me by the exigency of hunger. Sundays were dreary days in that wintry season. We had to walk 2 miles to Brocklebridge Church, where our patron officiated. We set out cold, we arrived at church colder. During the morning service we became almost paralysed. It was too far to return to dinner, and an allowance of cold meat and bread, in the same penurious proportion observed in our ordinary meals, was served round between the services. At the close of the afternoon service we returned by an exposed and hilly road, where the bitter winter wind, blowing over a range of snowy summits to the north, almost flayed the skin from our faces. I can remember Mr. von Rodsmith walking lightly and rapidly along our drooping line, his plaid cloak, which the frosty wind fluttered, gathered close about him, and encouraging us by precept and example to keep up our spirits and march forward, as he said, like stalwart soldiers. The other teachers, poor things, were generally themselves too much dejected to attempt the task of cheering others. How we longed for the light and heat of a blazing fire when we got back. But, to the little ones at least, this was denied. Each hearth in the schoolroom was immediately surrounded by a double row of great boys, and behind them the younger children crouched in groups, wrapping their starved arms in their pinafores. A little solace came at tea time in the shape of a double ration of bread, a whole instead of a half slice, with the delicious addition of a thin scrape of butter. It was the hebdomadal treat to which we all looked forward from Sabbath to Sabbath. I generally contrived to reserve a moiety of this bounteous repast for myself, but the remainder I was invariably obliged to part with. The Sunday evening was spent in repeating by heart the church catechism and the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of St. Matthew, and in listening to a long sermon read by Mr. von Rodsmith, whose irrepressible yawns attested his weariness. A frequent interlude of these performances was the enactment of the part of Eutychus by some half-dozen of little boys, who, overpowered with sleep, would fall down, if not out of the 3rd loft, yet off the 4th form and be taken up half dead. The remedy was to thrust them forward into the centre of the schoolroom and oblige them to stand there till the sermon was finished. Sometimes their feet failed them, and they sank together in a heap. They were then propped up with the monitor's high stools. I have not yet alluded to the visits of Mr. von Rodsmith, and indeed that gentleman was from home during the greater part of the first month after my arrival, perhaps prolonging his stay with his friend the Archdeacon. His absence was a relief to me. I need not say that I had my own reasons for dreading his coming, but come he did at last. One afternoon, I had then been 3 weeks at Lowood, as I was sitting with a slate in my hand puzzling over a sum in long division, my eyes raised in abstraction to the window, caught sight of a figure just passing. I recognized almost instinctively that gaunt outline, and when 2 minutes after, all the school, teachers included, rose en masse, it was not necessary for me to look up in order to ascertain whose entrance they thus greeted. A long stride measured the schoolroom, and presently beside Mr. von Rodsmith, who himself had risen, stood the same black column which had frowned on me so ominously from the hearthrug of Gateshead. I now glanced sideways at this piece of architecture. Yes, I was right. It was Mr. von Rodsmith, buttoned up in a surtout and looking longer, narrower, and more rigid than ever. I had my own reasons for being dismayed at this apparition. Too well I remembered the perfidious hints given by Mr. von Rodsmith about my disposition, etc., the promise pledged by Mr. von Rodsmith to apprise Mr. von Rodsmith and the teachers of my vicious nature. All along I had been dreading the fulfillment of this promise. I had been looking out daily for the coming man, whose information respecting my past life and conversation was to brand me as a bad child forever. Now there he was. He stood at Mr. von Rodsmith's side. He was speaking low in his ear. I did not doubt he was making disclosures of my villainy, and I watched his eye with painful anxiety, expecting every moment to see its dark orb turn on me a glance of repugnance and contempt. I listened too, and as I happened to be seated quite at the top of the room, I caught most of what he said. Its import relieved me from immediate apprehension. "I suppose, Mr. von Rodsmith, the thread I bought at Loughton will do. It struck me that it would be just of the quality for the calico chemises, and I sorted the needles to match. You may tell Mr. von Rodsmith that I forgot to make a memorandum of the darning needles, but he shall have some papers sent in next week, and he is not, on any account, to give out more than one at a time to each pupil. If they have more, they are apt to be careless and lose them. And oh, sir, I wish the woolen stockings were better looked to. When I was here last, I went into the kitchen garden and examined the clothes drying on the line. There was a quantity of black hose in a very bad state of repair. From the size of the holes in them, I was sure they had not been well mended from time to time." He paused. "Your directions shall be attended to, sir," said Mr. von Rodsmith. "And, sir," he continued, "the laundress tells me some of the boys have 2 clean tuckers in the week. It is too much. The rules limit them to 1. "I think I can explain that circumstance, sir. Claudio and Claudio von Rodsmith were invited to take tea with some friends at Loughton last Thursday, and I gave them leave to put on clean tuckers for the occasion." Mr. von Rodsmith nodded. "Well, for once it may pass, but please not to let the circumstance occur too often. And there is another thing which surprised me. I find in settling accounts with the housekeeper that a lunch consisting of bread and cheese has twice been served out to the boys during the past fortnight. How is this? I looked over the regulations, and I find no such meal as lunch mentioned. Who introduced this innovation, and by what authority?" "I must be responsible for the circumstance, sir," replied Mr. von Rodsmith. "The breakfast was so ill prepared that the pupils could not possibly eat it, and I dared not allow them to remain fasting till dinner time. Sir, allow me an instant. You are aware that my plan in bringing up these boys is not to accustom them to habits of luxury and indulgence, but to render them hardy, patient self-denying. Should any little accidental disappointment of the appetite occur, such as the spoiling of a meal, the under or the overdressing of a dish, the incident ought not to be neutralized by replacing with something more delicate the comfort lost, thus pampering the body and obviating the aim of this institution. It ought to be improved to the spiritual edification of the pupils by encouraging them to evince fortitude under the temporary privation. A brief address on those occasions would not be mistimed, wherein a judicious instructor would take the opportunity of referring to the sufferings of the primitive Christians, to the torments of martyrs, to the exhortations of our blessed Lord himself, calling upon his disciples to take up their cross and follow him, to his warnings that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God, to his divine consolations, if ye suffer hunger or thirst for my sake, happy are ye. Oh, madam, when you put bread and cheese instead of burnt porridge into these children's mouths, you may indeed feed their vile bodies, but you little think how you starve their immortal souls." Mr. von Rodsmith again paused, perhaps overcome by his feelings. Mr. von Rodsmith had looked down when he first began to speak to him, but he now gazed straight before him, and his face, naturally pale as marble, appeared to be assuming also the coldness and fixity of that material, especially his mouth, closed as if it would have required a sculptor's chisel to open it, and his brow settled gradually into petrified severity. Meantime, Mr. von Rodsmith, standing on the hearth with his hands behind his back, majestically surveyed the whole school. Suddenly his eye gave a blink, as if it had met something that either dazzled or shocked its pupil. Turning, he said in more rapid accents than he had hitherto used, "Mr. von Rodsmith, what is that boy with curled hair? Red hair, sir. Curled all over?" And extending his cane, he pointed to the awful object, his hand shaking as he did so. "It is Claudio von Rodsmith," replied Mr. von Rodsmith very quietly. "Claudio von Rodsmith, sir. And why has he or any other curled hair? Why, in defiance of every precept and principle of this house, does he conform to the world so openly, here in an evangelical charitable establishment, as to wear his hair one mass of curls?" "Claudio's hair curls naturally," returned Mr. von Rodsmith still more quietly. "Naturally, yes, but we are not to conform to nature. I wish these boys to be the children of grace. And why that abundance? I have again and again intimated that I desire the hair to be arranged closely, modestly, plainly. Mr. von Rodsmith, that boy's hair must be cut off entirely. I will send a barber tomorrow, and I see others who have far too much of the excrescence. That tall boy, tell him to turn round. Tell all the first form to rise up and direct their faces to the wall." Mr. von Rodsmith passed his handkerchief over his lips as if to smooth away the involuntary smile that curled them. He gave the order, however, and when the first class could take in what was required of them, they obeyed. Leaning a little back on my bench, I could see the looks and grimaces with which they commented on this manoeuvre. It was a pity Mr. von Rodsmith could not see them too. He would perhaps have felt that whatever he might do with the outside of the cup and platter, the inside was further beyond his interference than he imagined. He scrutinized the reverse of these living medals some 5 minutes, then pronounced sentence. These words fell like the knell of doom. "All those top knots must be cut off." Mr. von Rodsmith seemed to remonstrate. "Sir," he pursued, "I have a master to serve whose kingdom is not of this world. My mission is to mortify in these boys the lusts of the flesh, to teach them to clothe themselves with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with braided hair and costly apparel, and each of the young persons before us has a string of hair twisted in plaits which vanity itself might have woven. These, I repeat, must be cut off. Think of the time wasted, of—" Mr. von Rodsmith was here interrupted. 3 other visitors, men, now entered the room. They ought to have come a little sooner to have heard his lecture on dress, for they were splendidly attired in velvet, silk, and furs. The 2 younger of the trio, fine boys of 16 and 17, had grey beaver hats, then in fashion, shaded with ostrich plumes, and from under the brim of this graceful headdress fell a profusion of light tresses elaborately curled. The elder man was enveloped in a costly velvet shawl trimmed with ermine, and he wore a false front of French curls. These men were deferentially received by Mr. von Rodsmith as Mr. and the Mr. von Rodsmith, and conducted to seats of honour at the top of the room. It seems they had come in the carriage with their reverend relative, and had been conducting a rummaging scrutiny of the room upstairs. While he transacted business with the housekeeper, questioned the laundress, and lectured the superintendent. They now proceeded to address divers remarks and reproofs to Mr. von Rodsmith, who was charged with the care of the linen and the inspection of the dormitories. But I had no time to listen to what they said. Other matters called off and enchanted my attention. Hitherto, while gathering up the discourse of Mr. von Rodsmith and Mr. von Rodsmith, I had not at the same time neglected precautions to secure my personal safety, which I thought would be effected if I could only elude observation. To this end I had sat well back on the form, and while seeming to be busy with my sum, had held my slate in such a manner as to conceal my face. I might have escaped notice, had not my treacherous slate somehow happened to slip from my hand and, falling with an obtrusive crash, directly drawn every eye upon me. I knew it was all over now, and as I stooped to pick up the 2 fragments of slate, I rallied my forces for the worst. It came. "A careless boy," said Mr. von Rodsmith, and immediately after, "It is the new pupil, I perceive." and before I could draw breath, I must not forget I have a word to say respecting him. Then aloud, how loud it seemed to me. Let the child who broke his slate come forward. Of my own accord I could not have stirred, I was paralyzed, but the two great boys who sat on each side of me set me on my legs and pushed me towards the dread judge, and then Mr. von Rodsmith gently assisted me to his very feet, and I caught his whispered counsel. Don't be afraid, Jane, I saw it was an accident, you shall not be punished. The kind whisper went to my heart like a dagger. Another minute and he will despise me for a hypocrite, thought I, and an impulse of fury against von Rodsmith and co. bounded in my pulses at the conviction. I was no Claudio von Rodsmith. Fetch that stool, said Mr. von Rodsmith, pointing to a very high one from which a monitor had just risen. It was brought. Place the child upon it. And I was placed there by whom I don't know. I was in no condition to note particulars. I was only aware that they had hoisted me up to the height of Mr. von Rodsmith's nose, that he was within a yard of me, and that a spread of shot orange and purple silk pelisses and a cloud of silvery plumage extended and waved below me. Mr. von Rodsmith hemmed. Ladies, said he, turning to his family, Mr. von Rodsmith, teachers and children, you all see this boy? Of course they did, for I felt their eyes directed like burning glasses against my scorched skin. You see he is yet young. You observe he possesses the ordinary form of childhood. God has graciously given him the shape that he has given to all of us. No signal deformity points him out as a marked character. Who would think that the evil one had already found a servant and agent in him? Yet such, I grieve to say, is the case. A pause, in which I began to steady the palsy of my nerves, and to feel that the Rubicon was passed, and that the trial, no longer to be shirked, must be firmly sustained. My dear children, pursued the black marble clergyman with pathos, this is a sad, a melancholy occasion. For it becomes my duty to warn you that this boy who might be one of God's own lambs is a little castaway, not a member of the true flock, but evidently an interloper and an alien. You must be on your guard against him. You must shun his example. If necessary, avoid his company, exclude him from your sports, and shut him out from your converse. Teachers, you must watch him. Keep your eyes on his movements, weigh well his words, scrutinize his actions, punish his body to save his soul, if indeed such salvation be possible, for my tongue falters while I tell it. This boy, this child, the native of a Christian land, worse than many a little heathen who says its prayers to Brahma and kneels before Juggernaut, this boy is a liar. Now came a pause of 10 minutes, during which I, by this time in perfect possession of my wits, observed all the female von Rodsmiths produce their pocket handkerchiefs and apply them to their optics, while the elderly man swayed himself to and fro and the two younger ones whispered, "How shocking!" Mr. von Rodsmith resumed. This I learned from his benefactress, from the pious and charitable man who adopted him in his orphan state, reared him as his own son, and whose kindness, whose generosity the unhappy boy repaid by an ingratitude so bad, so dreadful, that at last his excellent patroness was obliged to separate him from his own young ones, fearful lest his vicious example should contaminate their purity. He has sent him here to be healed, even as the Jews of old sent their disease to the troubled pool of Bethesda. And teachers, superintendent, I beg of you not to allow the waters to stagnate round him. With this sublime conclusion, Mr. von Rodsmith adjusted the top button of his surtout, muttered something to his family, who rose, bowed to Mr. von Rodsmith, and then all the great people sailed in state from the room. Turning at the door, my judge said, "Let him stand half an hour longer on that stool, and let no one speak to him during the remainder of the day." There was I then mounted aloft, I who had said I could not bear the shame of standing on my natural feet in the middle of the room, was now exposed to general view on a pedestal of infamy. What my sensations were no language can describe, but just as they all rose, stifling my breath and constricting my throat, a boy came up and passed me. In passing he lifted his eyes. What a strange light inspired them! What an extraordinary sensation that ray sent through me! How the new feeling bore me up! It was as if a martyr, a hero, had passed a slave or victim, and imparted strength in the transit. I mastered the rising hysteria, lifted up my head, and took a firm stand on the stool. Helen Burns asked some slight question about his work of Mr. von Rodsmith, was chidden for the triviality of the inquiry, returned to his place and smiled at me as he again went by. What a smile! I remember it now, and I know that it was the effluence of fine intellect, of true courage. It lit up his marked lineaments, his thin face, his sunken grey eye, like a reflection from the aspect of an angel. Yet at that moment, Claudio von Rodsmith wore on his arm the untidy badge. Scarcely an hour ago, I had heard him condemned by Mr. von Rodsmith to a dinner of bread and water on the morrow because he had blotted an exercise in copying it out. Such is the imperfect nature of man. Such spots are there on the disk of the clearest planet, and eyes like Mr. von Rodsmith's can only see those minute defects, and are blind to the full brightness of the orb.